Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first online fundraiser. Patricia Locke Foundation's first online fundraiser is today. Throughout today, you will see various videos that will be broadcasted on our Facebook page, and we will reveal our website, first time for you to peruse, and there will be many interesting and significant items to purchase and contribute to our mission. What is that mission? Patricia Locke Foundation's mission include to educate and inspire all people as rightful beneficiaries of the human heritage and to advance humanity through individual and collective transformation and service. And as such, first of the videos today that will be posted will be on North American Indigenous Covenant, the divine covenant that was revealed to indigenous peoples of North America. So Kevin, my first question to you is this. Are there evidences for divine covenant that was revealed to North American indigenous communities and populations? And where does that evidence come from?
Well, the evidence is from the large and extensive body of musical liturgy, which is essentially the way that the oral traditions were contained and transmitted. And these are authentic traditions relating the appearance of these holy souls or divine beings that appeared throughout time amongst all the various different peoples here in North America. And we've been doing an extensive series of articles highlighting the traditions that these authentic traditions. And this is very much in keeping with one of the passions of my late mother, Patricia Locke, who, when she was just a child, attended so many occasions with her parents and her grandparents and the community in which the provisions of those various covenants were being observed and practiced despite fierce opposition and severe repression over many generations. And so this was at a time when my mother was young, when the general consensus was that the indigenous people were going to just disappear altogether. But yet, communities throughout the continent, throughout the hemisphere really, have held on to these authentic teachings. And so we're very blessed today to have this rich legacy now.
Can you give us some examples of these teachings that were revealed through the covenant given to the North American indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so the one that's the most important for the Lakota people is the appearance of this holy soul, and her name in the language is Ptehinchala. So the Ptehinchala is a buffalo calf, and then ska is the color, the white color, and then we is the woman, so it means the white buffalo calf woman, who, according to various different winter counts, years ago, each of the different bands would designate the keeper of the calendrical system, the way of denoting or marking time. So every winter they would put a pictograph in there, and many of them go back thousands of years. And so many of those winter counts corroborate the date of approximately 900 or 901 AD as the year when this Ptehinchala appeared. And so this is the most important and really the defining narrative of the kindred known as the Ocheti Shakoni, the people of the seven fireplaces. And of course, one of the dialects of that is the Lakota people. And this maiden brought these teachings, and this is according to one of the really important books on from Standing Rock. It's really the one of the most outstanding works in the field of ethnomusicology. This woman, Frances Densmore, came to Standing Rock in 1911, and she interviewed all the eminent elders there, and she amassed a collection of something like 600 or 700 songs. But then before they could proceed, these elders, they had a consultative gathering in which they decided that the most important thing they had to cover first was really the spiritual foundation of the people, which are the teachings of this maiden, this P'tēnchalaskawe. And one of the principal informant who was asked by this group to relate the narrative, his name was Ishnalawicha, which means he alone is a man. And he gave a long talk, but he summarized the essence of her teachings. And there were 10 basic points. He says, one was to possess great respect and reverence towards all things sacred. Two was to live as belonging to one family. And that just doesn't mean all humankind, but it actually extends out to all of creation. All of creation is living and vibrant and related. Number 3 is be always very faithful to promises. Number 4 is to cease hostilities against other nations. Number 5 is to always administer help to the sick. Number 6 is to comfort others in times of sorrow. Number 7 is show kindness toward every living creature on earth. Number 8 is remember the departed, the deceased. Number 9 is to love your children dearly. Number 10, above all, lead pure lives. So there were many other teachings that she brought, but these are 10 of the most preeminent of her teachings, the White Buffalo Calf Maiden. And of course, she really underscored and strengthened some of these are basically universal themes, but she also confirmed the pre-existing laws of fasting and prayer.
Fasting and prayer. So we see fasting and prayer all over in Abrahamic religions.
Yes.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and whatnot. So we see it as the common thread in all Abrahamic religions. So they were existent in North American Indigenous covenant all over this continent as well. All the teachers brought these same things.
Yeah, it's basically referred to as the golden rule all over the world. You know, all the divine revelators throughout time, throughout the history of humanity, have brought these spiritual laws, spiritual principles, which are universal. They're immutable. They don't change. Yes.
Yes.
Prayer and fasting are preeminent of those. It's really like the foundation or bedrock
of the whole humanity. So that's a great sign that the evidence for the divine nature of the covenant brought to North America. I can see that. So how come then when the European immigrants arrived on the shore of this land, they did not see the similarities between their own spiritual core, so to speak, and the indigenous peoples, but rather they call these people savages with no guiding principles? So how come did that happen?
Well, it's because they were totally bent on exploiting resources, and this was something which didn't start with Columbus, and you know that era in the late 15th century, early 16th century. It didn't start with that, but for a long period of time, the European powers had organized to carry out what's called the Crusades. And these crusades against the people of the Middle East, people of Islamic background, were especially brutal. They just totally wiped out whole communities in order to extract resource, extract wealth. And this was fueling this horrendous hierarchy in Europe, which was enslaving the peasantry and peoples just to get their land, get everybody's land. So it was creating this horrible dichotomy, this totally unlivable condition in Europe. And basically in this book here, it goes into great detail. It's called An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's highly readable, and she really explains this historical process in great detail. So by the time by the time these people had immigrant populations that had reached North America, they really had refined this whole process of mass genocide and extermination of peoples to seize their resources.
Well, the common thing that I hear people say, perhaps the way the Abrahamic religion, followers of the Abrahamic religion, worshipped and the way the indigenous people worshipped were quite different in the sense that indigenous peoples, they did not have any settlement, they did not have any social order. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's totally erroneous because, you know, the developments that supported large populations were the really intense horticultural practices, and these really intense horticultural practices had arisen in the Western Hemisphere, probably parallel to other parts of the world, and so at the same time, when, like, for instance, Cahokia, which is at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri River, so when Cahokia city-state was at its height, it was larger than London London and Paris at the same time.
Oh.
And there's these huge city-states all throughout the Ohio Valley. They call them the mound builders, the Hopewell cultures. They had created these huge trade networks and city-states throughout that whole region. And it was all based on that really advanced horticultural knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's the covenant that was brought the indigenous peoples here in North America resulted in large social organization and order that resulted in so-called sign of civilization, which is having an organized settlement. And you are saying there were large enough city dwellings and the settlement dwellings in North America that were comparable to London and Paris at the time when the immigrants showed up. How many such covenants would you estimate that were brought to North American indigenous peoples? Now, I want to say, I know from hearsay there's more than 500 tribes and peoples in North America at the time, at its richness and diversity. How many such covenants were brought to these people for how long a time period we're talking about? And can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, well, all of these diverse peoples, they all have in their sacred traditions, they all have a narratives which extol these some would, I think anthropologists would call them culture heroes, but if you really look at them and that they brought these universal laws and principles, you can see that they were inspired from a heavenly source, and so they were bringing these the golden rule, and so there are so many of them, and we've been doing articles in BahaiTeachings.org that elaborate on some of those. For instance, amongst the people in like what they call the Muskogeans, such as the Seminole, Miccosukee, Creek, they have the tradition of the breath maker, who brought the spirit, these immutable spiritual laws, social laws, and also many prophecies as well. You have the same thing. Probably the most noted and well documented is the peacemaker from the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse in the upstate New York area, such as the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, Oneida, and Tuscarora. And so these people have this have the recitation, which is all done by rote. It's done by memory, and it's recited several times a year in all the different communities up to this day, and that is the whole theophany or spiritual legacy of the peacemaker.
Oh, so here's an interesting question. So you mentioned at the time the European immigrants came, their intentions dating back many, many years ago, even with the Crusades and everything and the Papal Bull and all of that following that, was to gain personal riches and land and profit and material gains. So they stepped way far away from their spiritual core. Their incentives and motivations were nothing spiritual. So did the Indian covenant go through similar corruption compared to other Abrahamic religions? What would you comment about the Indian covenant and its purity?
Well, in pre-contact times, people would never try and forcibly convert each other. So they respect that, and so these covenants were operational and intact until they were brutally assailed from outside, from the immigrant populations, who condemned them as being satanic and demonic, and fit only for total extirpation or extermination. So this was one of the driving principles of the immigrant population, was to also eradicate the spiritual heritage of this land. And as I stated earlier, they were unsuccessful in doing that.
Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, the Abrahamic religions, for example, Judaism, Christianity, or even Islam, people can voluntarily, by their own volition, choose to come from a place of non-spiritual and material gain, and that's their choice. But in the case of the Indian covenant, it was forced on the Indian people by an external source, the European immigrants coming here, and later on the U.S. government, and deeming that these ways for savage-like heathenism and deeming them to be non-spiritual, to totally try to eliminate the spiritual core. So that came from outside of the people whom the covenant came. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
So that's a great distinction, and I always reflect on that distinction. And in the reason being that people can, after a while, when the teachings come to people, after a while they may step away from those teachings and choose a different way of living, and thereby corrupt those teachings and totally twist them around and thwart them. But in the case of the Indigenous of North America, I always wondered about the power and potency of the covenant when the spiritual ways are practiced, how it's preserved, and it always strikes me as how powerful those ceremonies and those spiritual ways are still today. And I always wondered about that, and I always thought about it, because it was never from the people whom those teachings came to, never walked away and corrupted those teachings, but they were forced not to practice them for a while, unsuccessfully, like you say. Ending point, I want to ask you, personally speaking, what do you get from practicing the covenant that was brought to your heritage, your people? That is the white buffalo calf woman you said, and the teaching she brought. Do you still follow them in your own spiritual growth? And what do you gain from that?
Well, to me, it is really a foundational bedrock in my life. I spent a lot of time with my mom's uncle, and that was one of the things he would always tell would be this whole legacy, the spiritual drama of the appearance and teachings of the Patricia, white buffalo calf woman, and how important it is. And one thing he would always emphasize was the prophetic aspect of her teachings, and how he lamented the fact that at his age he felt like he would never be able to realize the fulfillment of that. But then he would always tell me that I would see these things. I would see the fulfillment of these teachings. And so to me, my earliest spiritual foundation would be going out fasting, sun dancing. And so to this day, those songs that I learned so many decades ago, it's like the soundtrack of my life up to this time. No matter where I am, all those teachings, like the lyrics of the songs, they're all about the covenant. It all extols and defines different aspects, different facets of the covenant, a relationship between God and man. And so these things go through my mind all the time, every day, wherever I am, and they always inspire me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kevin.